services. But any questions on this idea of, one, an API, and two, this idea of encapsulating functionality and data inside? Okay, rarely, at least when building larger systems, rarely should you need to expose your object's properties as public, unless, as in the case of 50, it was just the expedient solution, and we weren't really working in that case with anyone else. All right, so let's take a look at where we're going with this. So this allows us to have this conversation about this, MVC, Model View Controller. So this is just a paradigm. It's kind of an oft-used buzzword, but it's very much in vogue, certainly for web development and even for desktop software, because it allows you to kind of factor out different functional components of an application and more easily update various pieces of it. So here we have a little picture of someone's computer, and this person is visiting, let's say, a website for now. And that website is implemented in the form of a file called index.php, which is typically the default. So we're going to start calling index.php a controller. Meanwhile, if this website has some kind of database for stock prices or a user's database or the like, I'm not going to write any of my MySQL underscore queries inside of index.php anymore. That was just too messy, right? In 50, especially pset 7, all of this functionality is commingled. But now we're going to start teasing things apart and drawing barriers between different types of code. So my controller is going to do that. It's going to control the whole application. So when it gets a request, a get or a post or similar, it's going to then decide, OK, to satisfy this user's request, say for the home page, I need to go get a list of users, or I need to go get this user's portfolio of stocks. But then what the controller is going to do, once it has that information, an array of users, array of stocks, it's going to pass that information to an entity we'll call the view. And maybe this is a desktop view, maybe this is a mobile view, but it's a different chunk of code whose sole purpose in life is to render information that's already been perhaps dynamically generated. And then finally, does the view get returned directly to the end user? Now contrast this. If you did take CS50 in the past few years with pset 7, CS50 Finance, contrast this with the following scenario. If in the middle of that week that pset 7 was in progress, we said, oh, by the way, your website should also be mobile friendly. Right? Like, it's kind of hard to do that and still maintain the same user interface you had spent that night or couple of nights working on, because you kind of have to design for different parameters. Smaller screen size, you need bigger icons. You really need two different user interfaces. But because all of your code for that pset in particular was probably hard-coded in quote1.php, quote2.php, by1.php, by2.php, you would have to pretty much copy and paste all those files, maybe move them to a separate directory and just call it m.pset7.com or whatnot, right? You couldn't really just tweak the aesthetics. So one of the compelling features of MVC is that if the design requirements change overnight, or you want to support some brand new iOS device that just got released whose screen size, like the iPad, is a little different from every former iOS device, the only code you need to change in theory is the red box, the views. And what are those views? They're essentially glorified HTML files with placeholders. So you would write your HTML, your CSS, maybe some JavaScript, but in separate files, and then you would plug in variables. So you can genericize things like your page's title and headings and footer, and you can factor these out into what we'll generally call templates. So we can now start to keep things much more cleanly designed. And the upside here, too, is that you can say to your partner, all right, you know what? I'm going to do the controller and view, but I need you to implement a users class, a stocks class, and some other class. I need X and Y and Z as methods, and for now I'm just going to assume they exist, because when I get requests from users for his or her stock portfolio or a list of users in the system, I need you to answer those queries for me. So you can now start drawing lines. Even if you don't have a partner, you yourself can compartmentalize functionality in this way. So we'll see in a moment a fancier framework called CodeIgniter that will make this both easier and harder for us sometimes. But let me go ahead and open up the following. So I'm in the CS50 appliance right now. And just for those on the fence about what they'd want to use, I've pulled up NetBeans, which comes installed when you update the appliance for CS164. I'm going to go ahead and say New Project. And just to give you a sense of what these things can do for you, I'm going to choose a new application with existing sources. Let me click Next. I'm going to fill in this blank, so sources folder. I'm going to choose example 0 that I brought with me. I'm going to specify PHP version 5.3, which is the latest. The reason the IDE cares is that there are certain language features that then it can help you with, for instance, autocomplete and syntax highlighting and the like. Where's the project? What's the project's name? 0, that's fine. Next. Now this is where these tools get more interesting, whether it's Eclipse or in the future Xcode or the like. You can configure them to automate a lot of tedious tasks. Right? In 50, some of you might have been in the habit of coding on your own computer or in the appliance and then uploading your files to the cloud. But every time you did that, you had to drag and drop files or use SCP or SFTP. Imagine a world in which you just click a button and all that happens for you. These are the kinds of things these things can do for you. So we can say run this code on the local web server. Let me go ahead and paste in HTTP. Let me borrow the URL here that I know it's going to end up in. Go ahead and paste in that URL, finish, and voila, what you get, for those familiar with gedit, is sort of a glorified gedit interface, but with some more buttons and menu options at top that will facilitate coding in this environment. For instance, let's see if I can do this on the fly. If, for whatever reason, I wanted to put a PHP chunk of code here, and suppose I wanted to do, let's say, x gets preg, all those functions you kept having to Google or look up on php.net, you get things like autocomplete, which if you've never used this, it's kind of useful. Now, I say that rarely using this myself, since I just kind of type it in, I use Vim usually. But especially from a learning curve perspective and also just a time-saving perspective, being able to do tab completion and the like for function names, being reminded exactly what's expected, it's kind of compelling. So realize if you're still living in a nano world or even gedit world, use the class as an opportunity to either try NetBeans or some other tool that your partner convinces you to use instead. All right, so what is this example? Well, let me go in here. And this is actually just a very underwhelming course website that we just saw before. And in fact, all I did to make this PHP is I changed all the file extensions from HTML to PHP. But underneath the hood, we have the exact same files. If I go here in NetBeans and open up index.php, after removing the silly code I just wrote, that's all this is. It's really just HTML, and I called it PHP. But notice it's linking to lectures.php. What's lectures.php? Well, that's this file here. Okay, really uninteresting. It's just HTML. But let's now use this simple website as an opportunity to start engineering this site in a better direction. In fact, what are some of the improvements I could make quite quickly, bearing in mind that at the moment we have index.php, lectures.php, and lecture0.php, and lecture1.php. How did I create lecture1.php? Yeah, I did. I copied and pasted it effectively, or the cp command, right? And what am I going to do next week? Cp. What am I going to do the week after? OK, there's got to be a better solution to that problem already. Moreover, what is probably shared among all of these files? So style sheets, CSS. So we were pretty good about that. At least we don't use CSS here, but even in 50, we at least encourage, like, factor things out into a .css file. But what more could we factor out? Yeah.
The menu bar.
Yeah. So we have the menu bar, the title of the page, right? The heading tag. There's a lot of common functionality that if you flip through these in more detail, the website looks almost identical on every page, right? And I can see this if I just click on lectures. Looks pretty similar. Lecture 0 looks pretty similar. Let me at least start factoring out the minutia of the page. So we did use require, or require once in 50 for PHP stuff. Let's see if we can't leverage that as a simple mechanism for cleaning up this code. So let me switch to a command line just so we don't have to create a new NetBeans project just for every one of these simple examples. And let me go ahead and do this. So this now is version 1. Up from 0. And I propose that this is a step toward what we called an MVC architecture, Model View Controller. Now, it's not perfect yet. And in fact, none of these will be perfect ultimately. But what have we done that's at least compelling here? I factored out the common code up top, and I factored out the common code at the bottom into two files apparently called header.php and footer.php, so that if I now open up header.php, that's all it is. It's pretty uninteresting, but at least I never, again, have to copy and paste that same code. How easy is it now to just change the title of the web page? It's super simple, right? I change it in header.php, and that's it. Every other page changes automatically, because if I look in, let's say, lecture 0, it's the same idea. I have some comments up top, but I'm requiring the header, I'm requiring the footer, and then I just have some raw HTML. So once you combine all three of those files, you have a complete whole. Now let's push back and start finding fault with these things already. What's bad about this design? Yeah?
You can have different titles on different pages.
Yeah, I kind of painted myself into a corner. The title of every page is now CS164. It's no longer lectures or lecture 0. I had to give that up, but hey, look how quickly I can update the site now. Other pushback. Be really nitpicky here. What have I introduced that I didn't, a price I didn't have to pay before? All right, so think to p set 6 if you took 50. Like the dictionary, like what did you try to avoid in the dictionary p set? Sorry? Well, actually, hard coding in that p set's pretty good. It tends to save you time. But other things. What costs time? Function calls, right? So function calls involve some modicum of time, right? You have to build up the stack. You have to tear down the stack.